Now we will discuss linguistic determinism and relativity. Sapir-Whorf hypothesis basically proposed two versions of the hypothesis, that is linguistic determinism and linguistic relativity. Linguistic determinism refers to the fact that language determines thought. It is not that just how people think depends on the variation in the language. Rather, the language determines human thought. Then we have linguistic relativity, which refers to the claim that the cognitive processes that are determined are different for different languages. So the concept of relativity is that it varies. People who speak differently from one another are the ones who look at the world around themselves differently. So people who think and perceive, they use different languages to reflect their perceptions and their opinion about the world. It is different people looking at the world differently, and that is the concept which has been proposed by linguistic relativity. Now we will look at some of the points under linguistic determination and relativity. Linguistic determinism is the idea that language and its structure limit and determine human knowledge or thought, as well as thought processes such as categorization, memory, and perception. The term implies that people who speak different languages as their mother tongues have different thought processes. Linguistic determinism is the strong form of linguistic relativity, popularly known as Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which basically argues that individual experiences relatively the world around them is different. Though it played a considerable role historically, linguistic determinism is now discredited among mainstream linguists because this is the version which received a lot of criticism, and many people have come up with the opposing ideas, opposing findings, contrary to what linguistic determinism talks about. After linguistic determinism, which was proposed by Sapir, in 1913s, Benjamin Lee Whorf, who was basically a student of Sapir, Edward Sapir, who was a linguist, then he began building on his mentor's Edward Sapir's idea and proposed that different languages represent different ways of thinking about world around us. This view has come to be called linguistic relativity. Because of this idea, Whorf was on the lookout for examples of language being culturally bound. Since this has to do with the cultural variation, therefore, the idea was to come up with different examples who could explain that. Exploring the grammar of the Hopi language, he concluded that the Hopi have been entirely different concept of time than European languages do, and that the European concept of time and matter are actually conditioned by language itself. One practical consequence of linguistic relativity is the direct translation between languages is not always possible. So the reason is that this particular hypothesis or version of hypothesis propagate that people who speak differently, they use different language. So with this, there is no margin of, or very little margin of, direct translation. So the linguistic relativity further proposes that since Hopi and English are not simply ways of expressing the same thing in different words, one cannot preserve thoughts or viewpoints when you translate between them. To conclude, Whorf hypothesis states that our language shapes the way we think. This hypothesis consists of two parts. One is linguistic determinism, which states that language determines thought, and another one is linguistic relativity, which states the resulting thought processes vary from language to language.